Hi, this is Randy Spivey, CEO and founder of the Center for Personal Protection and Safety. And I wanted to take just a couple of minutes as we're closing out the 2022 and moving into 2023 to share some thoughts and observations that we had from 2022, particularly as it relates to trends in violence prevention training, and just the increase in violence across our country and the impact that's having on various aspects of society. Back in October of 2022, the FBI published a report talking about crime statistics from 2021. And in it, they highlighted that in the year 2021, there was record increases in violent crime in the United States, particularly in the areas of murder and aggravated assault. A couple of days ago, the FBI director, Christopher Wray, was speaking and commented that from his observations and communication with police chiefs and sheriff's departments across the country, he believes that that trend of increasing violent crime has only continued and probably gotten a little bit worse as we went through 2022 and are moving into 2023. You see that in several sectors of our society. We had, one of the worst school shootings ever, if not the worst one, in Uvalde, Texas, in 2022. Towards the end of the year, you saw several extreme violence events happen on college campuses, to include several shootings, as well as a horrible incident with 4 students being killed at the University of Idaho, not too far from our Spokane, Washington office. And companies moving their headquarters out of cities where they perceive the violence to be untenable to stay located there. We've talked with individuals working in large companies and in cities who are saying that, it's a real concern for them, just the employees taking the train into the office or walking from the parking lot into the office building based on just crime being such a problem. You've seen certain companies that are closing offices, closing storefronts, Starbucks Corporation closing several of their locations from trying to respond to the violence and the safety concerns of their employees based on where they're located. So that's an unusual trend from what we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, where companies are just making active decisions to relocate or close operations based on their perception of violence and crime being where they're operating. I also think that we saw across the country that people want to do something to try and counter the violence, but in many cases, they don't know what to do. I'll use case in point just the issue of active assailants or active shooter incidents. Before the pandemic, the American Psychological Association came out and said the number one source of stress on the average American adult were these extreme violent active mass shootings, active shooter events. And, they haven't gone away. In fact, they seem to be increasing in frequency. They kind of go in waves sometimes, but it's certainly a real concern. And I think that because people want to do something but don't know what they can do, they have a sense of helplessness. And one of the things that we saw as a trend towards the latter part of 2022 was a dramatic increase in the financial ramifications of extreme violence events. I was talking with a corporate executive just a couple of weeks ago, and one of the perceptions he had was that if there was an active shooter or a violent event, that government agencies are immune from liability and responsibility in those because they're government agencies. In 2022, we saw the Department of Justice agree to pay the family members of those that were affected by the Parkland shooting in Parkland, Florida, $130 million in damages. The Department of Air Force, they were ordered by a judge to pay $230 million as a result of negligence with a former Air Force active duty member that they kicked out of the Air Force, but then because they didn't report it to the state authorities in Texas, he went and got an assault rifle because it was a domestic violence related issue when he was kicked out. And he wound up acting out in one of the worst shootings in Texas history at Sutherland Springs Church outside of San Antonio, where it killed 26 people. And because of the negligence of the Air Force, they were ordered to pay the families that were affected by that incident $230 million. Spectrum TV had an issue that was a workplace homicide issue, and it resulted in them agreeing to pay $1.1 billion. And of course, the horrible shooting at Uvalde, Texas, resulting in a class action lawsuit of over $26 billion, which, you do the math, that's roughly 12% of the state of Texas annual budget. There was a shooting at Walmart here not too long ago. One of the supervisors was the assailant and killed several of his coworkers. Already there's been two $50 million lawsuits filed, and I suspect there'll be a lot more by the time this is done. What I think is happening is that part of the reason that these financial payments are increasing is what I mentioned earlier, and that is that people are watching the violence increase around them. They're watching the instability or the perceived instability of our governmental institutions. I mean, right now we're struggling trying to get a new Speaker of the House of Representatives, and they want to do something. And so when they see one of these shootings take place, and particularly if they feel like there was negligence involved, that the jury's awards are increasing quite a bit. I was involved in a case several years ago that was a $5 to $6 million payout on an active shooter situation, and of course that's not, the numbers and the finances aside, it's horrible, just the trends and the loss of life. But we're seeing it shift, and it's going from the 7 figures into the 9 figures and 10 figures, which is unprecedented. I've never seen that happen. Some of the other trends that we're seeing, part of that, what can we do? What can local legislations do? What can our national legislators do to try and combat the issue of violence and extreme violence in particular? And typically what you see happen after an incident is our leaders and the politicians come out talking about both ends of the spectrum related to gun violence, where either they'll say, the whole problem is guns and gun control is the answer, or the flip side is that the only way to stop a bad guy is a good guy with a gun, and we need to have more guns in the hands of people. I think what you're starting to see is legislators trying to find something other than just gun control as a way to address the violence across the country. A couple of quick examples. The President of the United States signed an executive order that was related to diversity, equity, inclusiveness, and accessibility. Yeah, that was the title of the executive order. But inside that, buried inside this document, was a mandate and requiring of training as it related to domestic violence and workplace violence. And that was put in the executive order that just went into effect here a couple of weeks ago. Another one, the state of New Jersey came out with a regulation requiring that houses of worship throughout the state have and implement a security plan, and that it addresses the issue of active shooter in their house of worship. So that's a requirement now in the state of New Jersey. Tennessee just published a new requirement for security providers, security professionals working in bars or nightclubs, mandating that they have de-escalation training. We're seeing regionally legislation, regulations are starting to pop up as it relates to violence prevention or threat assessment or security assessments. No real solid national initiative yet to require it. But I think, what sexual harassment was in the 80s and 90s, we've said, this issue of workplace violence or campus violence, societal violence, and how we address that as a society is becoming more and more mainstream. When we first put out active shooter training in 2007, it was, fringe. It was, not mainstream. But now everybody knows what the term active shooter means, and according to the APA, causing folks a lot of stress. We're looking forward to 2023, increasing the resiliency within our organizations by increasing the resiliency of individuals across the country. So stay safe. Thank you.